She signed the papers with her hands shaking, not because she was weak, because the lawyer sitting across from her was the same man who had stood at her father's bedside, held his hand while he was dying, and quietly ensured the old man never recovered enough to stop what was coming. Her husband, Tobachuku Ezi, 34 years old, calm face, expensive suit, the kind of man who smiled at you while his hands were already around your throat. He had spent 7 years inside her family, eating at their table, learning their language, memorizing their vulnerabilities. And then, with the precision of someone who had been planning since before the beginning, he had taken everything. The company her father built over 40 years, the board her father had trusted, the accounts, the properties, the name, and he had not done it alone. The woman sitting beside him at that table, not as a lawyer, not as a witness, but as a presence, as a comfort, as the person who kept leaning over to touch his arm, was Chisamadalik, Adasi's best friend since university, her bridesmaid, the woman who had cried the loudest at her wedding, the woman who had sat on her kitchen floor at midnight and held her hand and prayed with her during every season of darkness. They had been together since before the wedding. 6 years of deception running underneath, 6 years of friendship like a second river that Adaiz never knew existed. Every secret she had confided, every strategy she had whispered, every document she had mentioned, every fear she had spoken out loud in the dark, all of it had traveled from Chisam's mouth to Tobachukwu's ear before morning. Adaiz sat at that table and looked at both of them. She did not scream. She did not throw the papers. She did not give either of them the satisfaction of watching her come apart. She picked up the pen. She signed her name. She stood up, straightened her blouse, and walked out of that room without looking back, because she had already made a decision that neither of them knew about yet. The day she destroyed them both was not going to be today. If someone has ever used your trust as a weapon against you, stay right here. This story is for you. And if this is your first time on Tales by Nexus, subscribe right now. Because what happens next will change the way you think about patience, pain, and the justice that God reserves for those who wait. To understand what was stolen from Adaeze Okonkwo, you have to understand what she was made of before the stealing began. She grew up in Enugu in a compound where the generator ran all night and the security men knew her name before she could walk properly. Her father, Chief Emeka Okonkwo, was not simply a wealthy man. He was the kind of man who had built his wealth by hand, starting from a single distribution contract he won at 26, by outworking every competitor in the room, and then spending the next 2 decades turning that contract into a logistics empire that operated across 11 states. He was also a man who understood legacy, and from the moment Adaize was born, his only child, the one his late wife had given her life delivering, he made a single decision that shaped everything that followed. He decided she would not inherit his company. She would earn it. He sat her down at 14 and made her read contracts while other girls her age were watching television. He brought her into board meetings at 16 and made her sit in the back and write down every question she wanted to ask but was not yet allowed to ask. He hired tutors for commercial law, financial modeling, and supply chain management. He made her defend her opinions in front of his senior managers, who were all men, all older, and none of whom made it easy. He told her, Adaize, I am not preparing you to take what I built. I am preparing you to protect it. Those are not the same thing. She understood the difference. By the time she graduated from the University of Lagos with a first-class degree in business administration, she had already redesigned the routing structure for one of her father's key distribution corridors and recovered 14% in quarterly losses that had been bleeding unnoticed for 2 years. His CFO presented the findings at a board meeting without initially disclosing who had done the work. When he revealed it was the chief's 22-year-old daughter, the room went very quiet. Chief Emeka said nothing. He simply looked at his daughter across the table and nodded once. That nod was everything. She was not a girl who had been given a throne. She was a woman who had been forged to hold one, and she was about to walk directly into the arms of the one man who had studied her long enough to know exactly. Tobechukwu Eze did not fall in love with Adaeze Okonkwo. He identified her. He had grown up in Onitsha in a household where money was always almost enough, close enough to comfort that its absence was a specific kind of humiliation, far enough from wealth that he understood from a very early age that the only way out was not hard work. Hard work was too slow and too uncertain. The way out was positioning, getting close enough to the right things that, when the moment came, he was already inside. He was brilliant, genuinely, dangerously brilliant. He finished law school near the top of his class, secured a position at one of Lagos's most reputable commercial firms, and began the careful work of becoming someone that powerful men trusted. He was never loud. He never oversold himself. He understood that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. He met Adaeze at one of her father's dinners when he was 25. He had not been invited carelessly. He had spent 6 months positioning himself close enough to the firm that handled Okonkwo Logistics contracts to ensure that his name would eventually appear on a guest list. When it did, he spent 2 weeks studying the family before he walked through the door. He knew Adaeze's academic record. He knew her role in the company. He knew that her father was aging and had no male heir, and that the succession question was one the board had already begun to discuss in private. He knew that whoever stood beside Adaeze when she took that chair would have access to everything. At the dinner, he waited until the room was thinning. Then he walked to where she stood near the window and said 7 words that he had rehearsed until they sounded unrehearsed. "Your father is great, but you will be greater." She looked at him differently after that. He had known she would. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that on the same evening, 3 months earlier, Tobechukwu had met Chisom Adeleke at a mutual friends gathering in Victoria Island, and that by the time he walked into Chief Emeka's dining room, he had already been inside the friendship, listening, mapping, learning everything about the woman he was about to pursue. Chisom had not been coerced. She had made a choice born of old envy dressed up as love, the specific bitterness of a woman who had watched her closest friend have everything she wanted and decided that if she could not have it honestly, she would take it quietly. Together they were patient. Together they were meticulous. Together they walked into Adaeze's life from 2 directions at once, so that no matter where she turned, there was a face she trusted looking back at her. The marriage began beautifully, as all the most dangerous things do. Tobechukwu was the husband women described to their single friends as evidence that good men existed. He remembered details. He showed up. He was the kind of present that felt like safety, the kind that, Adaeze would later understand, was not presence at all, but surveillance dressed in warmth. The first move was the finances. In the 2nd year of their marriage, he suggested they consolidate their accounts. His reasoning was loving and logical. They were building a life together. Managing money separately created unnecessary friction, and he was earning well enough now that it made no practical sense. She agreed. She trusted him. She did not yet understand that she was handing him the first key. The second move came when her father had his stroke. It happened on a Sunday morning. Chief Emeka collapsed during his morning walk and was rushed to a private hospital in Lagos, where he spent 11 days in intensive care before stabilizing into a condition the doctors described as chronic but manageable. His speech was affected. His memory became unreliable in ways that came and went unpredictably. He was no longer the man who could sit at the head of a board table and make every person in the room feel the weight of his intelligence. Tobechukwu was at that hospital every day. He brought food. He spoke to the doctors with the familiarity of a devoted son. He sat with Chief Emeka when Adaize needed to rest and held the old man's hand and spoke to him quietly about the company, about the future, about how he would make sure everything was protected. What Adaize did not know, what Fashola's drive would reveal 20 years later, was that Tobachukwu had been in private communication with her father's personal physician for months before the stroke, not causing the stroke. Something more careful than that. Managing the recovery, adjusting medications during the rehabilitation period in ways that kept the chief's cognition unstable just enough, just long enough for what came next. The board meeting that restructured the company's leadership happened 6 weeks after Chief Emeka was discharged from hospital. The chief was present. He was seated at the head of the table. He nodded when appropriate. What nobody in that room except Tobachukwu understood was that the old man's nod meant nothing. He had been told by his son-in-law that the resolution was a temporary administrative measure that Adaize had already approved. He had not verified it. He could not verify it. His mind on that day was not the mind that had built an empire. The vote gave Tobachukwu operational control. Adaize sat in that room and watched it happen and felt something cold move through her that she had no name for yet. She would have a name for it later. It was called the moment you understand that the war began before you knew there was a war. There is a particular kind of pain that does not come from enemies. Enemies you can prepare for. Enemies declare themselves eventually, even if only in small ways. A tone, an absence, a moment where the mask slips and the eyes go flat. You can learn to read enemies. You can build walls against them. You can sleep knowing exactly where the threat is standing. But a friend who is not a friend, that is a wound that has no location, because it comes from the place you deliberately left unguarded. It comes from the direction you never once thought to watch. Chisom Adeleke had been Adaize's closest friend for 15 years. They had shared a room in their second year at university. They had talked through the night about their futures, what they wanted, who they wanted to become, what kind of men they would allow into their lives. Chisom had been there the morning Adaize's mother died, sitting beside her on a hospital bench and saying nothing, which was exactly the right thing. She had been there the night before the wedding, calming Adaize's nerves with tea and laughter, and the specific tenderness of someone who knows you completely, or someone who wants you to believe they do. When things began to feel wrong inside the marriage, when Adaize started noticing the documents, the meetings she was excluded from, the board members who seemed to have shifted allegiance in ways she could not fully explain, it was Chisom she called. Chisom she met for long dinners, where she laid out her suspicions carefully and listened to her friend's outrage, which was always perfectly calibrated, always exactly as much as the moment required. Chisom never pushed her to act too quickly. She always suggested waiting, gathering more, being certain before moving. She framed it as wisdom. It was delay. Every piece of information Adaize shared went to Tobachukwu before sunrise. The server she had accessed, the board members she thought might be sympathetic, the lawyer she was considering approaching, the documents she had already copied. All of it, delivered quietly, across a relationship that had been running in parallel to the friendship since the beginning, fed by a combination of desire and resentment that Chisom had learned to manage the way you manage a fire you cannot put out, carefully in private, making sure it never consumed anything you needed in front of witnesses. When the corporate misconduct allegations surfaced, the one built around Adaize's access of the financial server, it was Chisom who had given Tobachukwu the specific technical detail he needed to make it credible. And it was Chisom who called Adaize the night before the final board meeting and told her she was praying for her. Adaize thanked her. She would not understand why that memory burned the most until 20 years later, when she read the messages on Fashola's drive and saw the timestamp on that phone call, 40 minutes after Chisom had messaged Tobachukwu to confirm that everything was in position. She left with her daughter in a bag, not because she had nothing else, because everything else was already gone, seized, restructured, transferred into entities that bore her family's name but no longer contained her family. The settlement gave her the surulaire flat, a monthly stipend, and her silence. Her lawyer said sign. The alternative was a public legal battle that would take years, expose her daughter to everything, and was not guaranteed to succeed against a man who had spent 7 years making sure every piece of evidence pointed in his preferred direction. She signed. Zara was 5 years old and too young to understand what was happening and old enough to feel it. Children always feel it. She held her mother's hand in the back of the taxi and did not ask questions, and pressed her face against Adizi's arm and stayed there for the entire journey. Adizi kept her eyes on the window and did not cry until Zara was asleep that night. Then she cried the way she would always cry from that point forward. Once, completely, privately, and never again for the same thing. In the morning, she made a decision. She was not going to spend her life nursing the wound. She was not going to tell her story to people who could not use it. She was not going to watch Tobachukwu's career from a distance and poison herself slowly with bitterness. She was going to build, quietly, precisely, with the same discipline her father had poured into her, which they had stolen the fruit of, but could not steal the root of. She registered a small consultancy under her mother's maiden name. She took every client she could reach without advertising. She delivered work of such unambiguous quality that referrals came without being asked for. She charged fairly and executed perfectly, and asked nothing from anyone except what had been agreed in writing. She raised Zara with intention. She taught her to read contracts at 12. She brought her into client meetings at 16. She told her that the most dangerous thing a woman can be is surprising, that the world underestimates quietly disciplined women right up until the moment it is too late. She was teaching her daughter. She was also, in a way she could not fully articulate, teaching herself, rebuilding the self that had been taken apart not just by betrayal, but by the years of slow erosion that preceded it. The years of being managed, redirected, diminished so gradually she had almost not noticed until she was already at the bottom. She noticed everything now. 20 years is a long time. It is also, when you are building something real, never quite long enough. Edizi Nwosu and Associates, the firm she had grown from a one-woman consultancy into an 11-person operation, was not famous. It was not meant to be famous. It was built to be trusted, which is a different and more durable thing. By her mid-40s, she was the first call for 3 mid-sized companies whenever they suspected internal financial irregularities. She had developed a specific expertise in identifying the kind of layered, corporate fraud that most accountants miss because they were looking at numbers and she was looking at structures. The relationships between entities, the timing of decisions, the way power moved through an organization in ways that documents only partially recorded. She had learned this expertise the hard way. She had learned it by spending 20 years understanding exactly what had been done to her. She was not bitter. Bitterness is what happens when pain has nowhere to go. Adiz had given her pain somewhere to go. She had turned it into precision. She did not date. She did not explain this decision to anyone because it was not a wound or a vow or a statement. It was a priority. She had 1 child, 1 firm, and 1 unfinished matter, and she had decided long ago that she would not allow anything that was not one of those 3 things to occupy her. Zara grew up watching her mother work, and learned without being taught that excellence was not a performance, but a practice. By the time she was 22, she had joined the firm and was already sharper in certain areas than consultants twice her age. Adais watched her daughter work sometimes and felt something she could not name, a pride too large for the word pride, mixed with a grief she had learned to carry without letting it show. This was what they had tried to prevent, this capability, this inheritance. They had tried to take it at the source, not understanding that the source was not a company registration or a board resolution or a signature on a settlement agreement. The source was a father who had sat a 14-year-old girl down and made her read contracts until she understood what they actually said. You cannot steal that. You can only delay it. Meanwhile, Tobechukwu had become everything he had designed himself to become. The rebranded Okonkwo Empire. He had changed the name, but not far enough, which Adayez noted when she allowed herself one annual review of his public profile, had expanded into real estate, telecommunications, and government contracting. He gave speeches at forums. He was photographed with ministers. He had remarried. He appeared from the outside to be a man whose life had gone exactly as planned. Chisholm was in London. She had built a comfortable life there. She posted occasionally on social media. Sunsets, restaurants, carefully curated evidence of a pleasant existence. Adaizi did not follow her. She knew because her daughter had mentioned it once, and she had asked her, gently but clearly, not to mention it again. Then, in the 59th year of her life, a message arrived through an intermediary she did not initially recognize. The sender's name was Akin Fashola. She knew that name. He had been a junior board member during her father's time. She had not thought of him in years. The message was brief and written with the specific economy of a man who had decided what he needed to say and was not going to waste the time it had taken him to decide. He was dying. He had something for her. He had carried it for 20 years, and he could not meet God with it still on his chest. He sent her a hard drive. She opened the files alone, at night at her office desk, with the door locked. She was methodical about it. She had spent 20 years being methodical. She created a copy before opening anything. She cataloged the folder structure before reading a single document. She made notes as she went. Old habits. The habits of a woman who had learned that information means nothing without organization. The first section was the board minutes, private sessions that had never appeared in official records, meetings held in Tobechukwu's office or at a private club in Victoria Island, attended by him and 3 senior board members, beginning 2 years before her father's stroke. The minutes were handwritten by someone other than Tobechukwu. She recognized the handwriting as Fashola's, which explained why he had them. They detailed, with the specific clarity of men who believed they were untouchable, exactly how the transfer of control was to be structured, which board members had already agreed, which regulatory contacts would smooth the paperwork, how the succession narrative would be framed publicly. Her name appeared in those minutes, not as a participant, as a problem to be managed. She read that section twice. Then she moved on. The second section was the correspondence between Tobechukwu and Chisholm. It went back further than she had known. The earliest message was dated 8 months before her wedding. 8 months. She was already engaged when they began. The messages were not always explicit. They did not need to be. What they revealed across hundreds of exchanges over more than a decade was the full architecture of what had been constructed around her. Chisholm reporting on Adaiza's state of mind. Chisholm flagging when she was suspicious. Chisholm steering her away from lawyers who might have actually helped her. Chisholm, on the night before the final board meeting, sending a single message that read, "She still doesn't know. We're clear." Adaiz sat with that message for a long time. Then she moved to the third section. The physician's correspondence was the section she had not been prepared for. She had known in a general way that her father's deterioration had been suspicious. The inconsistency of it, the way his clarity came and went in patterns that had never quite matched what the doctors described. She had filed that suspicion away years ago as something she could not prove and could not afford to dwell on. The messages on the drive were not a confession. They were careful and technical and written by a man who understood exactly where the line was and had chosen to walk as close to it as possible without crossing it on paper. But she was the kind of reader who understood the space between words, the medication adjustments, the specific timing of cognitive assessments, the recommendations that kept Chief Emeka classified as mentally diminished during the exact window when the board restructuring required him to be unable to object. Her father had not simply been unlucky, he had been held in place, deliberately, by a man he called son. Adiz closed the laptop at 2 in the morning. She sat in the dark for a while. Then she drove to the cemetery, even though it was the middle of the night, and sat outside the gates because they were locked, and spoke to her father through the iron bars in a voice barely above a whisper. She told him she was sorry it had taken this long. She told him she had everything now. She told him to rest. Then she drove home, made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and began to plan.